Housing affordability is, without doubt, one of the most pressing issues facing the United States today. A nationwide problem, most estimates place America's current housing deficit in the millions of units. Addressing this problem is complicated. You'll find all manner of reports, research papers, editorials, and commentators all staking their claim to a silver bullet solution. Recently, one of those solutions has garnered significant attention and controversy: the sale of federal public lands. The claim is simple. In order to build homes, you need land, and the federal government owns a lot of land. 640 million acres, in fact, 28% of all the land in the United States, the vast majority of which is concentrated in the West and Alaska. As this claim goes, we can simply sell these lands to developers. The developers can build houses on them, and the millions of homes America needs will then be built. As I said, the claim is simple. Too simple, in fact. This is not to say that we don't need to be building housing. We do. We need to be building a lot of it. Basically, every housing expert agrees. The reason we have a housing crisis in this country is because we are not building enough housing. But land is not the limiting factor in our inability to build affordable housing. Certainly not federal public lands, the vast majority of which are far from population centers, jobs, transit, and existing infrastructure. In short, the movement to use federal public lands for housing is proposing to build homes where there are no people to live in those homes, where the housing crisis is least acute. The movement is proposing to sell millions of acres of America's public lands without even addressing the main problem the movement aims to solve. That's what this video is about. I want to walk you through this issue in its entirety and help you understand why this claim makes no sense and why selling federal public lands for housing is not a viable solution to the housing crisis. Now, the history of attempted public land sell-offs in this country is long and varied, but for the housing angle specifically, I want to start this video in 2022, which is when Utah Senator Mike Lee introduced his Helping Open Underutilized Space to Ensure Shelter, or Houses Act. Lee referred to his bill as a quote-unquote new Homestead Act, and it is the perfect encapsulation of the sell public lands for housing philosophy. His bill would allow local/state governments to nominate tracts of what he calls unprotected federal public land to be conveyed to said state/local governments, who would then go on to sell those lands to developers to build housing. During the 2024 election, both major party candidates talked about using federal public lands for housing. And then, in March 2025, Interior Secretary Doug Burgum and Housing and Urban Development Secretary Scott Turner held a press conference in which they announced a joint task force to explore the possibility of using federal public lands for housing, although the details of their plan have yet to be released to the public. Recently, this issue has come to a head with the One Big Beautiful Bill. The House version of the bill originally included a provision to sell off 500,000 acres of federal public land, nominally for housing, but that provision was ultimately removed. In the Senate version of the bill, Mike Lee ostensibly revived his Houses Act by originally adding a provision to mandate the sale of up to 3 million acres. That provision was later deemed in violation of Senate rules, so he tried to come back with a sale of 1.4 million acres before the entire thing was scrapped from the final Senate version of the bill because of the intense bipartisan blowback. So, when you look at all of these recent events together, clearly, it has become politically relevant for elected officials to broach the public lands for housing topic. Again, both major party presidential candidates talked about doing this. There are countless op-eds about it, and commentary is everywhere, including my own right now. It's in the mainstream. People are talking about it. But what all of this recent talk fails to mention is that we already have laws on the books right now that allow for public lands sales for housing. They already exist. In 1976, Congress passed the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, better known as FLPMA, which allows the Bureau of Land Management to sell tracts of land less than 2,500 acres as long as they meet certain criteria. One of those criteria is, quote-unquote, community enlargement and economic development. Housing. Another example is the Southern Nevada Public Land Management Act of 1998. It allows the BLM to dispose of land specifically near the Las Vegas metro area. To date, the BLM has sold off more than 30,000 acres there, and the money from those land sales has been used to finance conservation projects elsewhere across the West. In other words, the way this bill works is you give up some land, in this case near Las Vegas, and then other land gets protected elsewhere. However, this is where we start to run into the problems that a lot of these land disposition bills seem to have. Under the SNPLMA, land has been sold and housing has been built, just not affordable housing, at least not much of it. According to the BLM's own data, of the 30,000 acres that have been sold off under this act, just 30 of them, 0.1%, has been used for affordable housing. Since the enactment of the bill, even adjusting for inflation, home prices in Las Vegas have more than doubled, and the region is still grappling with an affordability issue. This is because the bill includes no major affordability criteria. By and large, these land sales go to developers who simply build large luxury homes or McMansions and not affordable housing. That bill was passed under the Clinton administration, and current Nevada Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen has introduced a similar bill called the Truckee Meadows Public Lands Management Act for the Reno area. This bill also includes no meaningful affordability requirements, and neither does Mike Lee's Houses Act, nor did his additions to the One Big Beautiful Bill. Again, this is a big problem of these land disposition bills. They seem to take no interest in actually meaningfully addressing affordability. Unlike the Nevada bills, however, Lee's bills are not limited to specific metro areas. His bills would apply to almost the entire federal portfolio in the West. National parks, wildlife refuges, and wilderness areas are excluded, but pretty much everything else from his bills is fair game, including wilderness study areas, so-called administrative wilderness. Also, his bills don't include those conservation funding mechanisms like the Las Vegas one does. So he's proposing to just send most of that money to the Treasury to try and pay for tax cuts rather than reinvesting the money back into the land. Now, let's look at the viability of proposals like this. Proposals that target millions of acres of federal public land. Proposals that target the sell-off of huge chunks of the federal estate, not just isolated parcels or land already near urban areas. For this section, I want to draw your attention to 3 different analyses that have been conducted on this particular issue. The specific results of each of them are all different, but the overall conclusions they reach are basically the same, that the vast majority of federal public lands simply are not even suitable for housing. We'll start with an analysis conducted by the Center for American Progress, a liberal think tank. Their analysis looked at the 10 western states with the most BLM land, excluding Alaska, and found that less than 1% of the land in those states was within 10 miles of a significant population center. Now, their analysis didn't even look at whether or not those lands were even developable or not. Things like topography, or if it was in a floodplain, or if it had endangered species on it, or if there was already existing infrastructure to support that development, or if there were jobs available for the people who would be moving there. Nothing like that. They simply said, how much BLM land is within 10 miles of a significant population center in the West? 1% was their answer. This comes up against one of the main fallacies of the public lands for housing argument. The land is simply located where the people who need it most are not. Next analysis comes from Headwaters Economics, a nonpartisan economic institute. They analyzed 181 million acres of federal public land to determine how much was within a quarter mile of population centers of at least 100 people. Their answer? Less than 2%, or about 2.4 million acres. Again, this reinforces the last finding that the vast majority of federal public land is simply not located near population centers and thus shouldn't be considered for housing. But their analysis actually goes one step further too. They analyzed those 2.4 million acres, the ones that theoretically could be used for housing, for wildfire risk. This is, of course, a big consideration. If you're going to build housing, you need to make sure that you're not putting people in harm's way in a fire-prone area. And also, lots of insurance companies aren't even offering homeowners insurance in certain fire-prone areas anymore, a fact that would preclude a lot of people from buying these homes if they were built. So what did they find? Well, of those 2.4 million acres, 58% of them were considered to be too prone to wildfires, leaving just 1 million acres theoretically suitable for housing, and which, according to their calculations, could support around 700,000 units, mostly concentrated in states like Nevada and Arizona, which, as we've already seen, in a place like Las Vegas, it already has a law in place for the disposal of public lands, and it hasn't resulted in any meaningful affordability improvements. Also, this analysis, like the first one, didn't even take into account the developability of these lands, only the availability. So that million acres is going to shrink very quickly when you consider things like topography, infrastructure, existing rights holders, water availability. We'll talk about that later. But for now, this final analysis that we're going to take a look at comes from the Center for Geospatial Studies. Now, in my opinion, their analysis is the most comprehensive because they didn't just look at federal public lands near population centers. They also looked at whether or not that land was actually developable, a limitation of the other studies, and they looked to see whether or not that land was transit accessible, which is very important. Because for all my non-planners out there, which is probably most of you, land use and transportation are directly connected, and transportation plays a big role in affordability as well, not just housing. If you build a bunch of housing really far away from a population center that's not transit accessible, then even if you do save on the cost of the house, which isn't always the case, you're just going to pay more in transportation costs instead because you have to drive further. Transportation is often the second biggest expense in a household after housing. So this analysis factored that in to look for public land that was also transit accessible. And they didn't just look at federal public land, they looked at state and municipal public land as well, which provided some really interesting results. There's a link in the description to their mapping tool. They found that across the entire country, not just in the West, more than 276,000 acres of all public land was suitable for transit accessible housing, but just over 5,000 acres of that land was federal. You could build over 4 million acres of medium density housing. In their analysis, that's 15 units per acre on all public land, but only 78,000 of them could come from federal land. Now, I know that was a lot of data, but the picture all of these analyses paint is the same. Federal public land is simply not suitable for large-scale housing development. Only tiny, insignificant fractions are even located near people who actually need housing to begin with, and those lands that are close enough, they simply aren't developable, don't have adequate infrastructure, don't provide job opportunities, or lack proper transit access. So, as you can see, we're building up this case against using federal public lands for large-scale housing. By this point, we've pretty much already showed that the amount of federal public land that could theoretically be used for affordable housing is so minuscule as to barely be a drop in the bucket for the amount of units that we need in this country. Which means all of the people calling for the disposal of large swaths of federal public lands in the name of affordable housing, these millions of acres, are either A, incredibly misinformed, or B, acting in bad faith. I'm betting on the latter, but it's probably a mix of both, to be honest. But let's assume that we do move forward with some limited development on those tracts of federal public land that it could theoretically make sense to do so. Once again, we run into trouble, and the picture continues to be painted that federal public lands simply aren't suitable for affordable housing development, at least not on a large scale that's been proposed in multiple of these bills. I hinted at this earlier with the transit discussion, but simply put, there's a whole bunch of other stuff you need to build housing besides just land and houses. If we're talking about developing federal public lands, we're usually talking about greenfield development, which is development on a brand new site with no other stuff already built on it. In most cases, that land is going to require not just houses, but electrical lines, water lines, sewer lines, internet, roads, sidewalks, all of the things that a modern society needs to support human living. A developer is going to have to build all of that infrastructure from scratch, which is expensive. And ultimately, they're just going to pass that cost, most likely, onto the person buying the house, chipping away at the affordability gains that may or may not have been achieved through cheap land prices. And again, we already talked about transportation and land use, but I will reiterate that if you build further out without reliable transit access, the savings you may or may not have gained from housing costs is going to be eaten away at in transportation costs instead. Also, longer commutes equals more pollution. Now, those sorts of concepts really apply to basically all development. Like even if you live nowhere near federal public lands, but you live in the suburb of a major urban area, all of those concepts still apply to you. Inefficient land use and utility costs, longer commutes, all of it. Suburbs are wildly inefficient and do not pay for themselves in the long run. I will point you in the direction of channels like City Nerd and Strong Towns for more explorations on that topic. But we're not just talking about any other suburbs here. This video is about federal public lands and the communities that exist on or near them. These communities are often very rural, and they are often dependent on those same public lands for their economies and their ways of life. So let's dig into a couple of special considerations for these communities to further bolster our case against using federal public lands for housing. Number one, there's no jobs in these places. They're largely very rural and very remote and very far away from major job centers. Building large-scale housing developments on public lands makes no sense if there are no jobs available there for people to work. Two, the existence of these sorts of communities is directly tied to their proximity to these public lands. They're either tourist destinations where their economies are built on people coming to stay in them and then going to visit the public lands, or they're locations where people make their livings and their livelihoods from those public lands. In either case, these communities exist because the public lands are there, and if you take away those public lands to build a bunch of McMansions on them, you directly threaten the thing that those communities rely on to exist and destroy the appeal of living in them in the first place. In that same vein, number three, because these places are remote, scenic tourist destinations, the demand to live in them is already sky high, which artificially drives up the price of housing. Ultimately, what this means is if you just build market rate housing in these communities, the only people who are going to be able to afford to buy those homes are the ultra wealthy. And they're probably just going to use them as second homes or short-term rentals, which of course does nothing to alleviate housing prices and is already a huge problem in communities like this that are surrounded by public lands. Jackson, Wyoming is like the poster child for this. It's famously the place where the billionaires are pushing out the millionaires, but also Vail, Moab, Bozeman, etc. So again, just building housing on public land near these communities without meaningful affordability guardrails and regulation of second homes and short-term rentals is not going to make a dent in the affordability issues these communities are facing. It's a very specific problem. Number four is particularly irksome to me. I see it parroted around in all sorts of op-eds and talking points all the time. Looking at you, New York Times. And that is the assumption that the public lands near these communities are empty or barren, or they're a wasteland, or nothing lives there. As this line of thinking goes, it's basically good for nothing else except plopping a bunch of houses down. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of how conservation works. It drives me crazy, and it is just perpetuating the fallacy that scenic beauty is the only value that matters when it comes to landscape preservation. No, actually, these lands are critically important for clean air and water, biodiversity preservation, cultural preservation, recreational access, and yes, the economy. Just because they look empty to you does not mean that nothing lives on them or that they do not have other value. But perhaps the biggest conundrum for all these sorts of public lands communities, number five, is water. The Western United States, where the vast majority of our federal public lands are located, and where all of these land sale proposals are targeting, is incredibly dry. There's no water out there, certainly not if you start building millions of homes on top of the already overtaxed and overallocated water infrastructure that is already there. Nature simply can't support this level of development. In fact, Phoenix, Arizona, one of the fastest growing cities in the US, had to stop issuing building permits for new construction because the developers couldn't guarantee that they would be able to provide water for the homes they were already building. And finally, let's end this segment, these special considerations for a lot of these communities, by seeing how the people who live here feel about selling public lands for affordable housing, selling the lands that are in their backyard. Well, shockingly enough, they don't like it. The annual Colorado College Conservation in the West poll asked specifically about this issue. They found that 81% of Westerners are concerned about the cost of living. It is a priority for them, but just 14% of those same Westerners support selling off public land to build housing. More than 80% support building housing closer in to existing communities. You basically won't find any other issue in American politics today that many people agree on. Public land sell-offs are broadly, deeply unpopular across the political spectrum, hence the backlash you probably saw about Mike Lee's proposed public lands sell-off. But again, we do need to be building housing. There is an affordability crisis in the United States, and we simply need to build more homes to address it. Just not on federal public lands. Here are some other solutions instead. This isn't like the main scope of this video, but I do just want to get you thinking about some of the alternatives to building on public lands and how we can better plan our communities to reduce sprawl and environmental impacts and to preserve our public lands, which clearly a lot of Americans cherish and enjoy and want to see preserved. Number one, in our existing urban areas, especially the areas where the housing crisis is most acute, we need to adopt zoning reforms that promote density and infill development. It is currently illegal to build anything other than a single family home on 75% of the residential land in America's cities. All this does is perpetuate sprawl and all the negative externalities that come with it, so we need to find solutions that concentrate our development in existing urban areas where people and jobs and infrastructure are, which will alleviate the demand to use public lands instead. Number 2, we need to make it more financially feasible to build affordable housing. Right now, the finances simply don't work for a lot of developers to build anything other than luxury homes and apartments, which of course come with luxury prices. I'm not an expert in this area by any means, but there are a lot of people who are, and they're saying we need to change the finance situation to get the math to work for developers to build more affordable housing. And number 3, there actually are certain scenarios where building on public lands makes sense. Not large-scale sell-offs. We've already talked about that, why we shouldn't do it. It's really bad. But targeted strategic areas like land swaps are an example of this. If a parcel of public land is surrounded entirely by private land, that parcel is already extremely difficult to manage efficiently, and we're probably just better off trading it for another parcel. However, if we do that, we need to make sure there's no net loss of public lands and specific guardrails in place to ensure affordability. This is something that no legislation to date has addressed, and we should not even entertain the idea of these bills selling off public lands unless they are smaller in scale and provisions for affordability are included. All right, let's start to wrap this thing up here, shall we? We started with this idea that a lot of politicians and anti-public lands folks have, that the US has all of this public land, hundreds of millions of acres that we can use to build affordable housing. Sounds like a lot of land, because it is. But once we start applying all of these filters, the land isn't near where people are. It's not actually developable. There's no infrastructure to actually support housing. There's no jobs. There's no transit. It's in a fire-prone area. There's endangered species on it. People use it for recreation and to make a living. Public opinion is against it. All of these things start to whittle away at this argument. But proponents of plans like this, especially ones that target millions of acres for sell-off, they never get to that part. They never tell you why federal public lands are unsuitable for large-scale housing development. And the bills they draft, while publicly claiming to be for affordable housing, never include any meaningful affordability requirements and would only result in us losing our land and subsidizing luxury homes for the wealthy. Land is not the issue. And so I hope that this video was able to convince you of that and to give you a clearer picture of why we shouldn't be using our federal public lands for housing. And if somebody starts using those familiar talking points about doing so, you can point to this data and this analysis and these arguments to refute them and to ultimately help bolster the argument that our public lands belong in public hands. Okay, all right. Boy, that was a doozy, huh? I know that was a long one, but if you're here at the end of the video, man, you probably know a lot about housing and public lands now, which was exactly the goal of this video. So thanks for sticking around to the end. But you probably also really care about public lands, in which case, you're in luck. I have over 100 videos on this channel that you can go back and watch all about national parks and public lands. Or if you want to help support productions like this one directly, which took me a really long time to make, it involved a lot of effort and research, took me over a month to get this whole thing together. Those aren't easy to make. And I have a Patreon where you can help support these productions directly. I rely a lot on fan funding for a channel like this because it's pretty niche. I talk about topics that are not very mainstream and widespread. And I have a lot of good stuff over on my Patreon that you can get in return for your support over there. Discord community, trip reports, AMAs, director's commentaries. You can get your name in the credits, all sorts of goodies. That's patreon.com/National Park Diaries if you are interested. All right. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.